"That's for me to know, nigga, and for you to find out," Porky replied sharply. Big Ed drove the car up the driveway of the motel until he found their unit, then parked in front of the door. They all piled out. Dave removed a small overnight bag from the glove compartment and carried it in. The motel room was similar to motel rooms all over the country. Small, neat, with a dresser and tiny kitchenette. Porky dropped his coat on the bed and picked up the phone. He gave the unit number of the motel to the person he called and hung up. 20 minutes later, they heard the sound of a car pulling up beside theirs. Porky motioned Dave to go into the bathroom, while Big Ed continued to measure out small amounts of milk sugar on the dresser with a $10 spoon. Porky peeped out the window as someone knocked softly. Satisfied that it was the right person, Porky opened the door. Sid walked in with a small, weasel-faced man following him. Sid was short and fat, with a jet-black complexion. He twisted a cigar around in his mouth as his small pig eyes swiftly scanned the room. He noticed the partially open bathroom door. "Who the fuck you got in there, Porky?" he asked sharply, his hand slipping under his overcoat. The question caught Porky by surprise. "Just a little precaution to make sure I don't get ripped off while I'm over here," Porky answered as he removed the money from his pocket and laid it on the dresser. Sid ignored the money. "Get him out here," he commanded harshly. He stepped back against the wall. His bodyguard leaned against the door, his hand conspicuously bulging from his overcoat. "Dave! Dave, get the fuck out here!" Porky yelled, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The door opened quickly, and Dave walked out. His face twitched nervously. He could feel the muscles contract, but couldn't control them. Guns and violence were something he had an innate fear of. He knew better than anyone that he was completely out of place trying to act the part of a gunman. Sid nodded towards his bodyguard. The man moved quickly to the bathroom and kicked open the door. Finding it empty, he turned back and faced the room. With a cold smile that never touched his eyes, Sid said, "Just checking, Porky. I wouldn't want to walk into no whale plan stick-up either." The room was full of hostility. Neither person trusted the other. Sid picked up the money and counted the bills quickly, with a sureness that comes only to those used to handling large amounts of money. Again he nodded. His gunman moved to the window and pulled back the drapes. He removed a small flashlight from his pocket and blinked it twice. Porky's heart skipped a beat. There was fear inside the room. Everyone knew that the first wrong step would fill the small bedroom with violence. "It's just my woman, Porky, bringing the stuff in," Sid explained quietly. "I don't take no chances with people from out of state. I know you know what I'm talking about." It didn't need explaining. Porky knew just what he meant. His city was beginning to get a reputation as a city full of informers. He stuck a cigar in his mouth, his stomach swelling with knots of fear. The knock came almost unexpectedly. Big Ed moved over to the door and glanced out. His hand clutched a .38 automatic. "It better be a goddamn woman," he growled. He relaxed and opened the door, holding the gun down so she wouldn't see it. A small, light brown-skinned woman entered. She was dressed expensively. At the sight of Porky, she hesitated for a brief second, shocked by his hugeness. Her 300-pound Sid was dwarfed by comparison. Porky looked at her like an expensively dressed gorilla smoking a cigar. "Give me that stuff, woman," Sid ordered. "I got 10 pieces, Porky, that you can put a 6 on." Porky took the stuff from her outstretched hand and held it out to Big Ed, who pocketed his gun and carried the dope to the dresser. He opened one of the packages and filled up his $10 spoon and sprinkled the dope on top of 6 piles of milk sugar, which he had moved to the center of the dresser top. He sifted the dope and milk through his sifter over 8 times until they were thoroughly mixed together. Then he measured out a $10 spoon and dropped it in a cooker. Dave started cooking the dope up for him as he tied up his arm. Quickly, he found a vein, filled the dropper up with dope, and hit. Impatiently, Porky waited for his judgment. "Well?" Porky asked, unable to hold back any longer. "Is the shit worth it?" Big Ed closed his eyes and wet his lips as though he were tasting the dope. "It ain't nothing to write home about, Porky, but it will sell. It's just about as good as that stuff we got now. Everybody in the room seemed to have been holding his breath, waiting for the decision. Sid laughed, relieving some of the tension in the air. Is that good enough for you, Porky? He asked, as his fingers closed over the money. Staring at all the loose dope on the dresser, Dave got excited and started to fart loudly. Porky laughed. That's one way I can always tell dope, Sid, he said in an amiable tone. Every time that nigga gets around some dope, he starts to fart. Both men laughed agreeably as they watched Dave rush to the empty cooker and push a small amount of the dope into it and drop water on top of it. Sid picked up the money and started toward the door. Anytime you want to get down, Porky, just give me a ring. It's nice doing business with you. His bodyguard peeped out the door first, while Sid gave the envelope full of money to his woman to carry. It was just another precaution he was taking, one Porky was quite familiar with. If anyone got busted, she would be found with the money, and it was much simpler to fight a sales case on your woman than one on yourself. Even if the woman was found guilty and sent to prison, she was easy to replace. As soon as the door closed behind them, Porky wrapped up the 10 pieces of pure he had bought. Get them works clean. We're leaving, he snapped. That's yours and Dave's, Ed, he said, pointing towards the small amount of dope they had cut up to test. He waited until Ed had picked up his dope. Let's go, Porky yelled, nervous now that the business had been completed. Dave snatched the works out of his arm, wishing he could have jacked off the works a couple more times. He rinsed out the works quickly. Porky and Big Ed were already at the door. Here, Porky said, handing Big Ed all of the dope. Bring your goddamn ass on now, Dave, or we're gonna leave you in this fucking ass hotel. Dave ran out the door behind them. You want me to turn the key in first, Porky? Porky climbed in the back of his brougham. God damn the key, he snarled. They can keep the deposit and shove it up their ass for all I care. He settled back in the comfortable cushions of his car. In less than 10 minutes, they were back on the highway. They hadn't been in Chicago an hour, and now they were on their way back home with a car full of dope. 13. The wind rattled her windows, and she could feel a draft coming through the broken pane where papers covered the jagged hole. The noise from her single radiator had kept her awake most of the night. The steam hissed constantly, and the pipes rattled loudly. When she became fully awake, her first thoughts were fear-ridden. It was not the first time she had awoken with this nagging feeling of dread for the coming day, nor would it be the last. Terry rolled over and sat up. Her blanket slipped down to the foot of her bed, and as she tossed back the sheet, her lovely breasts could be seen through the transparent nightgown. Only there was no one to admire her in her lonely room. Her nose was running as though she had a cold, but it was not from a cold. It was past time for Terry to have her morning fix. She sniffed as she climbed out of the bed and made her way stiff-legged to the dresser. She fumbled around, searching for old, used pieces of cotton. After she found 5 of them, she put them in a cooker and poured water on them. She lit 2 matches and held them under the cooker until the water got hot. She pulled out her dropper and stuck it in the cooker, drawing up the stuff, hoping and praying that it would be enough to get her sickness off. After shooting the water into her arm, she cursed angrily. It hadn't been enough. She was still sick. Suddenly there was a loud knock on her door. She could hear Minnie hollering on the other side. "Wake up, Terry! Somebody's taking your car away!" Terry ran to the door, then turned around and ran back and grabbed her coat off the only chair in the room. She put it on and ran out of the room, following Minnie, running barefooted. They got outside just in time to see a tow truck pulling away from the curb. She stopped as the icy snow began to freeze around her bare feet. A sob escaped from her as she watched her car disappear down the street. "Who do you think it was?" Minnie asked broken-heartedly. It was a deadly blow to her, losing that car. For the past 2 months, she'd come to rely upon the transportation. Her stomach had become so large from her pregnancy that it was almost impossible for her to catch a trick. Her only chance of making money had been when Terry took her around to the shopping centers to shoplift. Both women stared after the car, dumbfounded. They stood in the street, watching long after it disappeared, as though some freak chance of fate would bring it back. Terry was openly crying now, tears running down her cheeks. She happened to turn and look up to find Porky's evil face leering out of his window. He had known her car was being repossessed even before she had. He licked his lips as he watched her from his window. Slowly he stuck his tongue out at her, knowing she understood what he meant. He watched as her head jerked up and fire leaped from her eyes. Some of the old arrogance was still in her, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Just wait until the junkie sickness hit her. Then he'd see just how proud she would be. "What we gonna do, Minnie?" she asked childishly as she retraced her steps back towards the hotel. "I ain't even got nothing to wake up on." Minnie took one last look down the deserted street. "I ain't either, Terry. I had a little left from last night, but I shot that this morning before I went outside."